the contractual organization in France. And this is probably reflected in the types of buildings that one sees in France now, when one takes into account that probably, in fact, every other field is uniquely of a high standard design, i.e. cars, clothes, engineering in the sense of its own, of roads and bridges and so on. It's very high, but architecture in general is of a very poor quality. This has now been probably recognized, and our own contract was a pilot project, the first project ever, of a new form of contract. When we arrived in France, can you hear me? Right there?
Can I put this on? Yes, we'll turn off the PA. We'll turn it low so that you don't hear that feedback.
Right. When we did the competition, well, let's going back even a bit further. Some of you may have heard me talk about this already. I actually wasn't very keen. I personally wasn't very keen on doing a competition anyhow, for a variety of reasons. Major one was considerable doubt about whether one could do a building in the center of Paris of that scale and size without strong political interference, and whether in fact it could be justified to create such a large centralized art culture center. Also, I think probably in England, perhaps even more than in America, we have a fear of the word culture, and it's called a building for culture, and therefore we tended to say, well, culture. So the first thing we did was to change the name. We called it a center of information and entertainment and culture, and concentrated very much on the information entertainment side. We also divided the program into two areas. We divided the program in the program as stated and what we then called the non-program. And that was the areas added by the engineers, architects, and the design team to the program. A reinterpretation of the program, which is probably the key thing. In other words, the program itself was purely asked for a library, basically, a library, a museum. Then all the other activities, the school, the plaza, the staircase, the escalator systems of restaurants, little cafes, the local life, which one tried to encourage, was things which we tried to develop as an addition to the program, of course with no extra budget, which was the major problem. One of the things in doing the competition, and I was outvoted, and therefore we did the competition, it was one of my fortunate days, was that, because I also said it was impossible to win it, and one of the things that we did is we misread the fees. We misread the fees. I think it was 5% fees. It said there will be 5% fees, and we thought, great, that's architect's fees, that's fine, we'll do that. But in fact, it was fees for everything, included the fees for landscape, for engineering, for everything. So when we arrived, we were told actually 5% was going to be for everybody and everything. We said we're going home again. So that was our first major battle. We arrived, and literally the first of the time we realized this was a major problem. And after a sort of amazing weekend where we kept on packing our bags and saying we're going home, and then they'd say no, we'll find another way of doing it. In the end, they produced a new form of contract which they had already been working on and talking about, or certain people had been talking about, which was close to the form of contracts that we have, the conditions of engagement that we have here, with two major differences. One is that the architect becomes responsible for being on cost and on time, and that if he is late or over cost, in fact, if the final price of the building is under or above 12%, then the fees are affected on a sliding scale. Therefore, your fees are tied to the production. In the hands of the clients that we had, it wasn't tremendously serious. I have doubts about it. But it could be dangerous in the sense that one can see a whole series of lawsuits and lawyers' work moving into the architects and the design team and the engineers. But it wasn't very serious from our side. As I would also say, whilst we're talking about how we worked, and how one worked in France, is that basically we always start every project. First meeting with the client is always attended by the architect, the engineer, and the cost control person, quantity surveyor in English. And we attend every meeting from the first day onwards with a team of at least 3 or 4 different design people.
Thank you.
You mentioned that you were working on an experimental structural element, I think it was, or skin element, that was composed of concrete and fibrous glass elements. And I was under the impression that glass was corroded by the alkali of concrete. And I was wondering how you overcame that problem.
Yes, that's the big breakthrough. Normally, you have a corrosion. There is now it's very secret. We don't even know what it is because it's not. It was discovered by the Building Research Station and then taken up by Pilkingtons, who are the British major glass manufacturers. And it allows for the cement and the glass to bond together without the usual action. There is one problem which still exists with the material. We have already used it on a number of buildings. It's very good because you can spray it quite simply. It's 10% glass fiber, 90% cement. You can mold it, or you can press it. The one problem we are finding is if you put it in positions where there's a lot of structural strain, it still suffers from brittle fracture after about 7 or 8 years, very slight. So therefore for panels and for domes it starts to work, but in pure structural elements there is slight signs of brittle fracture, which is what we're working on now.
How about creep?
No creep. What we think is happening is that given time, the cement dries to such a point that it grips the glass so tight that the tap cracks the fibers. And therefore what one needs to find is an elasticizer which allow it a little bit more movement over a longer time. That's basically it. We're not sure, in fact, but that's what we think it is. The nice thing about it, of course, is that one of the possibilities of this material is the fact that you could have mobile factories. In other words, you could start to, instead of having to sort of send off to vast centralized companies where you order X thousand tons, etc., and you don't see it until it arrives on site, by which time it's too late. You could perhaps start to consider, although that's still possible, to consider also the idea of making small components, small shells or panels or whatever it is, actually on the site, because it needs very simple materials.
How thick of a shell are you talking about?
You could spray 1/8 of an inch, let's say, a bit under probably. Then, of course, you can make a sandwich out of it. I mean, you'd spray it. It depends what you're doing with your load bearing. I'm just saying for panels rather than shells. Let's say we would use about 1/8 of an inch for a panel. Then we might use polystyrene or PVC or steel or wood or whatever else you want as sandwiches or secondary structures or whatever with it. You can have 2 skin coats or whatever you want.
When are we going to be able to use this material?
No, actually, it's already going under license in America, but I can't remember who with. But I'm sure. But one could find out quite easily by. There must be a Pilkingtons is one of the biggest glass monopolies in Europe, so I guess one must be some branches out here. It's one of its problems. It got votes by many architects as the most hated material of the year because it's probably nearly too flexible. In other words, it's a bit too easy to reuse wrongly. It doesn't have the freedom itself is quite a problem. At the same time, of course, it hasn't got the transparency or the translucency of plastics, which is a disadvantage. But it's much cheaper.
I wasn't at your lecture, so this question might be redundant, but the design, did it have anything to do with, for instance, when they were cleaning Paris, there were a lot of scaffoldings up. I'm sure this has been asked before. Any intentional similarity?
No. The only similarity is they were very interested in scaffolding, but that has nothing to do with Paris. Same thing as you are. I mean, sort of. Scaffolding has many connotations, and I think the major connotation it has, as far as we're concerned, is that it's an open-ended system. You can, and we feel very strongly that it's part of the architect's responsibility to know about, how a building goes up and how it is dismantled, but even further, how the material is dug up out of the ground, how it is treated in a factory, how it is stacked and stored, how it is transported to the site, how it is erected, how it is maintained, and how it is dismantled. Scaffolding systems are very good, especially in most of those areas. In other words, they're easy to stack, you can put them up, you can pull them down, and within more simple systems, you can use existing ones. Beaubourg is a somewhat more complex system, having large spans, therefore it's no longer exactly scaffolding, but there is obviously a relationship. Many people used to say to us, when are you going to take the scaffolding down? Talking about, obviously I guess was the structure they were talking about.
Did you have any idea of the impact it would create?
No, well, I don't think one, it's very difficult. You're sort of working, you don't really look too much beyond the what you're doing, what you're working at. Of course there were a lot of attacks. It was very, we had a lot of lawsuits, specifically by the French Architectural Association and things like that. We had the usual sort of problems, like Jean Prouvé was on the jury, and they took Jean Prouvé to court a number of times because how dare he be on the jury as he isn't a qualified architect, inverted comma. So we're still doing that sort of games where you have to be sort of, at 80 years old you still have to prove that you have that little piece of paper that says, architect or whatever. And so there were lots of those sort of problems, and then there was a tremendous amount of attacks from the press generally in its early stages. Did you? He's terrific. I mean, he was a godsend to us.
Is there a general feeling of people that live around with good or bad?
Yeah, it's always very difficult. That's a question that we ask ourselves, and obviously often are asked. But how do you actually take this reading? I mean, we have a number of stories. I have one which of an architect friend of mine who was looking at the building one evening, and a lady went up to him and said, do you like the building? And he said, at last, thinking that he could sort of get off his chest that he knew the architect and he liked the building, he turned around and he said, yes, I think it's a great building. And this lady really picked up an umbrella and hit him over the head. So I guess if you look at it that way, that's at least one person who just... But I'm not sure how you assess it. Of course, there is a change in the area. The change is already coming in the area. That's partly why it's cited there. In other words, it's it's a neighborhood in crises. On one side, the Marais is the oldest part of Paris. It's one of the great parts of any European city. The Marais itself is basically 16th century, 17th century. Place de Vosges is one of the classics. And the whole area has hardly been spoiled. It's one of the very few areas in any European capital. Right on the edge of that is the site where we were building, which fortunately was a car park when we arrived. Had the site having been cleared in the 1930s because it used to be, or it is the major brothel area, and so as to get rid of prostitution they demolished the buildings. And so we were working at least on a clear site. Beyond us is the Les Halles, which is the central market for the whole of Paris, or was the central market for the whole of Paris. That was demolished about a couple of years after we started. So you have, in a sense, a whole change. On one side you have this very historic quarter, which is going through a change because it's now the place to live in, because it's the most beautiful place. Therefore the people who used to live above the shops are now being forced out by high rents. Then there's Beaubourg, which is also sending the rents up because the area is now becoming much more a desirable area. And then there's Les Halles, which used to be this fabulous market, and sort of with all its secondary activities, its cafes, its restaurants, nightlife, soup d'oignon, and the whole thing. And the removal of that has totally changed that area.
Have they done anything with the land where they tore down the alley?
Below ground will be the major Paris interchange between rapid transport, metro, bus, car, and in that sense that's very good because it's very close to Beaubourg. It's about three blocks away, so you can link straight through. Above ground, it's going to be about 50% park, which is probably a good thing too, because Paris suffers from being the city in Europe with least open space, and so in some senses that's not an illogical thing to do there. But it's been a battleground again. It's been a political battleground even more than Beaubourg. One of the big changes in sort of public acceptance of Beaubourg, or probably one of the big changes in journalistic acceptance of Beaubourg as far as the press was concerned, was that immediately the public began to use it at about 5 or 6 times greater number than was expected, because everybody had sort of stated that nobody would go. And the program, the analysis of the activities which go on in Beaubourg produced a figure of 5,000 to 10,000 visitors maximum per day. And after opening, and since then we've been hitting between 25 and 45,000 people per day, as against 5 to 10. That made an amazing difference. I mean, the press changed overnight. I mean, after the first 4 days, where it went from 5 to sort of 45, the press just changed tack, and the people then started to accept the building much better as well, much more. But up to when it was open, it was hell. I mean, it was a tremendous resistance.
Is there any chance of the information screen coming back on the front of the building?
Well, there's 2 problems, as usual. One is that's part of the so-called non-programmed activities which we've been trying to work with. Of course, the activities that the design team want are never financed. In other words, there is a budget for the library, for the museum, for the Boulez Music Research Center. All the rest of the money is money you steal from somebody's budget, or sort of, you know. And as obviously nobody wants to lose control of their own departments, it's very difficult to find any extra money. So that was number 1 problem. The other problem, which was nearly as serious, was the fact that audiovisual is a very political problem, because who controls it? You know, with the possibility of having a couple of 100,000 people passing by in a day in the square, because when I'm talking about 45,000, I'm talking inside the building. It becomes a major political arm. In France, television and radio is controlled by the government. And then the whole question is, you know, will that be, should that be, and so on. So one of the reasons, we had a lot of those sort of problems. I mean, the whole question of would the left wing control the building, would the right wing control the building, and so on. And again, France is very much, you know, Gaullist, left, right. It's still very clearly divided. There's not so many shades as probably as there are here.
Did you think about that when you were first proposing that whole system?
No.
It seemed like that was one of the crucial points.
It was one of the crucial battles we lost. All equipment is there in the sense that all the engineering of the structure is designed to take the screens, all the bolt pieces are there to take it. The electricity, the computer services, the audiovisual systems down sort of level 1 and so on, the actual machinery is there. All that we're lacking is the screen. We also did all the work, and a lot of it with firms from LA, to make suggestions about the type of screens and develop a 24-hour per day screen with a lenticule system. All that work is there, but whether anybody will come along and actually use it depends very much upon who really gets control. The client that we had originally was an exceptionally intelligent client, a sort of senior political figure in his early 70s, who, though with not tremendous understanding of the broad implications of the building, had a lot of, well, once we gained his confidence and vice versa, had a lot of time for us and stuck to us. But then immediately the building was completed, he was moved out for political reasons. And a complete bureaucrat is now in charge, for instance. And he really is a complete bureaucrat. At this point, we haven't got a hope. So, but the next guy might be okay.
If that happens with regard to what you're just talking, what means are there for monitoring the use of the building to effectively change according to you know, some of the principles that we use in designing buildings? I mean,
Sorry.
Is there any means of monitoring the building, and what procedures are there for monitoring the use of the building in order to determine what changes should be effected and if any, what how do they
People keep on saying, and I suppose if you're working as we are, you know, in a sort of a building which is based on the idea of change and of being able to reflect the, you know, different specialist and popular needs, then obviously it can be done in either direction. You know, so if I can just as easily reflect what we might call the sort of bureaucratic arm as it can a more liberal organization. And there's not very much you can do about it. One of the implications, for instance, has been that we tried to establish before finishing the building a team who would be able to change the building, adapt the building as change demanded it. And change does demand a lot of change. There's a lot of changes which should happen. For instance, I said, obviously the whole idea of having an average of 25,000 people a day instead of 5,000 people a day creates a whole series of new problems which were not programmed for whilst we were working on the building. They're not terribly difficult to tackle, but you need a dynamic organization to handle them. One of the probable mistakes we made is that we thought, as it was a deep plan building, the offices of the building, which take about a third of one major floor, should be office landscape. And I don't think we probably allowed the fact that probably the French are the last people in the world ever to be able to handle office landscape, because the political and social structure in France tends to be very vertically organized, with a very clear head and a very clear sort of office boy structure, you know, and all the links all the way up. And office landscape systems, or any form of open systems, tend to fray the edges of that form of hierarchy. Therefore, in fact, what's happened is that it's not that they have got used to the system, it's that the system's going to have to be changed. Now, to do that sort of thing, one needs a constant team, and there isn't one, to adapt the building, to fight those sort of battles.
How do you feel about the relationship between the exterior and the interior? Does the exterior detract or add to what's going on inside?
Well, the aim was that the exterior was going to be the key, in the sense that the interior were large, loft, highly serviced loft spaces, and that the curator, librarian, or whatever it is, would adapt the building in answer to the needs of that, you know, at that time. Then the interior, within certain limits, could be left to itself. In fact, one of the remarks that I remember being made by Philip Johnson was that when he arrived about 2 years before the building was opened, he said, "Where are the plans?" And we said, "We don't have plans," because basically the interiors were just big open spaces, and they're very limited things like toilet boxes which are plugged into any point within the plans. On the other hand, the exterior we tried to service more heavily because we knew the battle was going to be tougher. And also because the whole movement system happens to be on the exterior. I mean, it's an inside-out building. The interior is just free plan spaces with no vertical interruptions, you know, 170 meters by 50 meters. Whilst the exterior, you have all the streets in the air, corridors, escalators, and so on. It's these things which, in a sense, give the building animation, and it's these things which also give what we've now tend to term public performances. In other words, people come because people are there. One of the more exciting things is, which has drawn a lot of people, many more than we realize, again, we didn't realize many of these things, is that the escalators have become key magnets, because it's great passing people on them. You know, it's just and especially against the view of Paris, so you get this sort of flow. And just like any popular area, like you know, people come to see people, and the corridors and the glass corridors, the glass escalators, and the square have become major activity spaces. On the good side, apart from the escalators and so on, what we didn't probably appreciate is that once you have that number of people, then people come to do their own bits of art. So practically the circus has now managed to arrive and has arrived and encamped on the site, or and it will be encamped for sort of 4 months of the year. There is a flower market which is coming on the site. Then there is all sort of fire eaters and sword eaters and razor blade eaters and mime shows and singers and jazz and trios and so on. And all these, so that the square is amazingly full. I mean, it's very full. To a point where, again, we have certain problems with the police who don't like it. because of course again you have a question that immediately have crowds, they can get out of control, and so on. So the exterior activity space becomes a major thing, and we tend to say, well, ideally the building hasn't got a facade, it's got an activity diagram, if you like. The facade, whether it's glass or panel, or whether it's solid or translucent or transparent, is very unimportant. You can change it. And in fact, in many areas, we lost control of those areas. Specifically, and I'm not talking about the skin, shall we say, because of such things as fire. Fire control laws were literally made up as we were going along building the building, and people would come along and say, you can't do that. Because it's the first building, for instance, in France, which is of a grand hauteur, which is above 2 stories high, which is for public use as against offices, in other words, popular. Therefore, the rules were made specifically related to security and fire, literally as we built the building. One of the last battles we lost was the whole of one side of the building was, for instance, enclosed because of sudden change in fire regulations. I'm saying this because I strongly feel a great danger looking around here, trying to be polemic, in a sort of skin aesthetic building, where everything is related to the beauty of the detail between the glass and the mullion. And it's, I think, very thin. And that it is very questionable, in my opinion, though it can be very beautiful, as a direction with any great future in it. Because of its amazing formality, apart from anything else. Because if you just put one door in the wrong place, you've had it. You know, I mean, the whole thing goes.
In the same vein, I've heard the opinion expressed that Beaubourg is functional structuralism taken to its extreme, and the epitome. And I wonder if you agree with that statement. And for me, it's almost Baroque. If that's true, what's the future for architecture?
Well, one always is arguing this one, isn't it? I mean, it's often been said, I've heard about it in so many buildings, it's the last building of the 19th century is the usual one I get. You know, it's a sort of backhanded compliment. I mean, I don't think there's anything extreme. I mean, there's thousands of areas where I think both Renzo and I, for instance, just to take that situation, are not satisfied. There are lots of things which one would not probably maybe would do differently, and of course programs change. I'm not sure that, and certainly again one wouldn't say it's a conscious attempt to be a structural purist. In fact, all that we've been talking about so far is program rather than structure, probably, or activity and performance. We do believe strongly in that one of the ways in which grain and scale and change can be expressed is to know how to handle the materials, and to know how you handle the materials is a structural problem, whether it's a panel or whether it's a beam or whether it's a shell. And in the end, even on this high and low technology thing, and we have done quite a lot of work, oh no, not a lot, we've done a certain amount of work on low technology buildings as well. The key thing is mastering the material rather than mastering and getting the right answer to the problem. Obviously, building a major building in the center of Paris is somewhat different to building a office block, to take an example. It has a different usage. And ditto our house. Therefore, I would be worried to think that Beaubourg is a general answer to anything. It's an answer to a specific problem at a certain time, which is what Beaubourg, Beaubourg is to us, and a certain approach. But we have done other buildings which are not quite the same.
Have you had any comment from Giacotti?
I gather there has been, I can't remember what it was, but I heard someone mentioning it. But I think he thinks that it's now really come true.
I can see him putting on a wonderful
Yes, I heard.
Can I ask a structural question? Why do you have the riverettes at all in the system?
Well, probably more time to spend in that area. The building is made out of 3 types of steel, if you like. It's basically all the compression members are hollow tube, all the tension members are, as they don't have to take buckling, are solid rods, and then there is the castings. The castings take all 3-dimensional forces, in other words complex joints, any joints, and the gerberets, which is a sort of joint. That's the basic primary steel system. There is a secondary steel system. I'll come back to the gerberet, which is the smaller pieces, which are the pieces which are clipped on, which is much closer to a scaffolding or erector set system. We use the word meccano or erector set as quite a lot. And all smaller pieces are standard pieces, which are easy to find off the shelf. But when you get to very large pieces, then you have a question that if you use standard pieces, you are beginning to have considerable wastage. So Ove Arup's, the engineers with whom we did a competition, and actually who pushed us into doing a competition, and when we said no, we didn't want to, said they would pay us $500, so we did it for our expenses. Ove Arup's came up with the solution of doing castings because they felt that they could be more economic in the use of materials because they could be closer to the computer analysis, shall we say, or to the forces acting than standard pieces in those complex situations. Now, when we first designed the building, we actually had two columns, a double column at each end. In other words, the structural area was these large bridges or platforms supported by a double column. But the problem was you take a beam, and either the beam reaches the first column, in which case what the hell do you want a second column for outside, or as we had during the early period, you have a rocker. In other words, you have a double structure like this, you have another double structure like this, you have a beam. If the beam lands on this, all the forces are taken by this one. If the beam lands on this, all the forces are taken by this one. We had to get the beam landing on the middle. But the problem was to extend the beam to land on the middle was more expensive than taking it on the first one. So we were going around in a circle and trying to find a way in which we could actually keep our zones of activities, where all the mechanical services, where all the people were moving, and making it logical. And our first research, we thought it was logical, but we soon found our system wasn't logical. Then came up this system which was produced by Arabs, which were based on an engineer called Gerber, who I believe lived in the the later part of the 19th century, and which basically was a system where the node, which rests on a single column, has its end pulled downwards to, in other words, in tension, thereby pushing up the beam. So in the end you had this extra piece which was rather like, which pulled the beam in this direction, thereby changing the loading system and limiting the amount of steel we needed in the beam. Well, again, one of the serious problems we had, and which we didn't expect to have when we first arrived in Paris, one of the many serious problems, was that there was a sudden limit of height on the building due to the height of the fireman's ladder. And we had to get the building theoretically within 28 meters. So floor to ceiling heights became very, very complex. Again, we had to find a very slender form of beam. This is all part of the problems which we had to face, and very simple and very slender nodes. We also, in the same time, we had to find a much more economical form of construction than we had first thought, because there was no budget originally in the building, for the building. In the competition there was no budget, which was very suspicious. When we did about the first 6 months of work, when we arrived in France, we thought, fantastic, no budget. This is the architects and design team's dream. And then after about 6 months, the client turned around and said, but your building is going to, we've just analyzed the costs, and your building is going to be twice as expensive as the budget. And we said, what budget? And he said, well, there is a budget, but we didn't want to tell you because we thought it might interfere with your design talents. And it did interfere with our design talents, and therefore we had to do a lot of paring down and reorganizing, of course. That's just part of the concept.
I'm a little confused. Does the center beam simply rest on the end of the gerberets, or does the gerberet, because of that downward action, induce a positive moment through the center beam? Which?
Yes, the beam rests on the end of the gerberet. The gerberet has a column. Okay, excuse me. Okay, that's your gerberet, and that's a column. And on the end here, and that's the rest of the building is over here, is the beam. It catches on the end of the gerberet here, which is hinged, okay? By applying a force here or tying it down here, you're pushing up, and therefore you're getting a...
Does the beam simply move up and down on that? vertebrae?
No.
Or is it positive moment?
There is a positive
Being
moment.
bent up.
There is a positive moment.
But don't the trusses just rest as the pin connection on the Gerberets?
There is a pin connection which allows it to rest in one direction, but there is a moment which holds the Gerberet in that direction downward. Therefore, the whole of the face of the building, in fact, is intentional. Well, not the whole, but
What
practically
I'm
the whole.
saying is that the beam, the truss itself, sits on the Gerberet. Isn't that just a pin connection?
There's a pin connection which basically transfers some of the load across the Gerberet into the face, which is on the square. And in fact, the foundation system is one which is basically, in other words, when the column comes down and where the tension skin comes down is a continuous system, and is the same is in fact the same foundation because the forces go around.
Could you briefly describe how the structural system is made fire resistant?
Yes, just to do it briefly, but it's pretty ad hoc in many ways. It was probably the most serious problem we had to face. Again, the way that the French construction industry is organized is one where control is applied basically by insurance firms. In other words, if you do not do your detailing as given out by the insurance-controlled offices, then your insurances go up. Therefore, there's a standard form of detailing, basically, because no client is going to pay for extra insurances. On the good side, you can argue that it's more secure that way, but of course it limits experimentation. For fire, we were unable to, or we had great difficulty in performing tests. We used a lot of research work for fire, which was produced by US Steel, by British Steel, and by Japanese Steel, who are probably the three most advanced fire research organizations. And at first we thought we were doing fine, until in fact in the end the French said we're not going to take anybody else's advice. And we were forced back onto using moderately conventional systems. The basic system is that of course all the steel out beyond the facade is sufficiently far away from the facade to make it to leave it unprotected, to leave the steel unprotected. At all joints, even with steel beyond the facade, all joints have panels in them. In other words, wherever a joint between a beam and a column appears on the outside, right behind it there is a solid 2-hour fire break panel. There are three basic panel systems to start with, which we use to keep the fire in. There is solid panels which are to give 2-hour fire and heat resistance. There's wired glass which gives you a half-an-hour flame, and then there is the ordinary glass plus the space between the steel and the glass. Now these panels have been in constant change. This is part of this whole question of not having a static facade. In other words, as the laws were changed by the fire research station in France, so we had to change the facades. And much of this decision is political, by the way, again, because for instance, the people who make the decisions about how the fire protection is going to be applied is the French steel industry. It happens, and it's a long story, but it happens that the French steel industry were very bitter about losing the steel contract to Krupp. They applied a lot of force on us, because obviously they had the controls at that end. For instance, then going to the steel, if it's not outside, and if it's not in a position where the mass of steel is sufficient to allow for 2-hour fire at 500 degrees centigrade, is protected by a variety of different materials, from a rather expensive thin material called mandolite to very standard protections behind the stainless steel covers by forms of asbestos. We had hoped to use a much more interesting American product, which is a byproduct of the space industries, which is basically like chemical ice. You apply this thin layer, rather like a paint, and unlike the normal paints which just expand, this actually effervesces. As it effervesces, it takes the heat off. It's being used in Disneyland, of course, but we were unable to use it in France, partly because of the French restrictions, partly also because of the unwillingness of the American industries to take what they thought was a gamble too early on in the development of this material.
In that vein, trusses then are at some points asbestos, at some points they are wrapped in a thin.
Well, there are also some material, anyway internally, there is always some material around the truss. Internally, always. It varies depending on the thickness of the, or on the need for the fire problems, let's say. So it also depends on the thickness of the steel. The steel wall, we are allowed sometimes, with great difficulty, to use the thickness of the steel wall as part of our calculations for the 2-hour fire protection systems. Obviously, the more massive the steel, the more likely it will last some time in that sort of fire without total failure.
Do you feel a contradiction between the sort of imagery of the building as off-the-shelf, throwaway, changeable, modular piece, stick it up and take it down and put another one up, and the reality of a building which is likely, if I understand what you said, to be relatively inflexible, just in terms of the people who administrate it, and also in terms of the way the pieces were made, so that in fact, instead of a kind of off-the-peg thing, you have all this very special sort of construction, which in fact seems to result in something which is predominantly a kind of imagery, but in fact that the imagery is in contradiction to the spirit of the building as it's explained.
I think that as far as the program is concerned, I think change, you cannot tell how change will take place. I mean, whoever would imagine that de Gaulle was going to take over in 62, I mean, it's an amazing thing. So maybe, and I know who's going to get in the next election. It's going to be pretty close. I'm not saying it'll be better or worse, but there could be a strong change. We don't know too much about the whole Euro-communist side, to take an example. Now, this may or may not affect the building. In fact, strangely enough, the two strongest backers politically of the building were the far right and the far left of the building. I don't know what that means, but that's and the whole, it was the whole middle strata that was against it. Now, change, I think, does take place. It takes place just like it takes place. I mean, it doesn't take place as well as here, because obviously here in a smaller community where you're working towards the same thing, but change does take place. I mean, the office will move out. There is a whole new, the library has changed amazingly since we first started the program, just because of the whole audiovisual equipment revolution, as far as, which now means that the library, instead of being 1 million books, it sounds a bit like your library here actually. Originally there was going to be, because we're in reverse, there was going to be 1 million books. Instead now there's only going to be 500,000 books, because the audiovisual equipment is slowly, completely phasing out a lot of the books which would normally be necessary. The library takes about 50% of the people who visit the building. It's the most successful department. It's difficult to get into, it's vast, and it's overcrowded. It's very popular with all its cassettes, with its films, and so on. All this means that it is changing. It may well be the curator of the museum is likely to be changing. The library, head of the library moved out 3 months ago. Who will take over? I don't know. If it's a go-ahead administration, the library could be an area of expansion, I would guess, because it's subscribed. So on that part, I would say change, yes. On the other part, I tend to agree with what you said on the technical side. I think that the scale of the building is such that technical change happens at well, first of all, it's not off the peg. Only the secondary steel, and so we divide primary and secondary because of this, is off the peg. The rest is only off the peg in the sense that you have massive tubes and so on, but they're not off the peg like off-the-shelf systems like here. On the other hand, all the things that you can clip on and off, in other words, the facades which make the terraces, you can make terraces where you want in the building. The galleries, the enclosed galleries, the open and closed areas, the fire stairs, the stairs, the escalators, all these things can be changed. All those things which give life to the building. the basic structure can't be changed. It's unlikely that anyone's going to suddenly put a column in the middle, I suppose, and it may be possible it'll grow down the street, but it's unlikely that that'll happen as well. I must say that given another bash, one of the areas that I would like to do further work on would have been the use of more standard components, probably. And I think that probably it's tending to push us towards doing further research in small span construction. Maybe this is a reaction to that large span systems. But I mean, one's always searching.
That brings up another question just in terms of what you're likely to do having done this. And as a consequence of the fact that it gets the attention that it gets, it creates for you a kind of imagery which is already predicted before you start to do it. And I wondered, for example, if you would be inclined, in terms of the way you look at doing buildings, inclined to do something which would contradict it. If you have any interest in things like Yale mathematics building as a kind of contradictory type, or whether having done this thing that you're typed in such a way that you couldn't do anything else if you wanted to.
I don't know about what the future holds, that's impossible to tell. But I mean, in a sense, if we're talking about the Yale mathematics building or a school of work which is totally different, then it isn't our approach. I mean, we're much happier with this type of building. In other words, we're not likely to, it would not be our answer, had we been invited to do the competition, it would not be our answer, the answers that were put forward. Most answers which we saw anyhow.
Well, at a certain point, I would assume that imagery, like all other imagery, gets a bit stale. If not for one generation, then for the one that comes along after it. And having done and achieved, obviously, a level of success at that.
I think you should answer. How much have you changed, Conrad? How much have you changed over your approach over the last? I think you get into cosmetics and fashion, and whatever you do, you'll do it. The next guys will laugh at it anyhow, so forget it. I mean,
you don't think there's an aspect of fashion to what you did?
You will apply. The historian's job is to sort of tabulate things, if you like, probably, or often is, and they decide it's brutalist or opera or what the hell. I can't see that one changes because of it. You follow through certain approaches. Those approaches are influenced continuously by things that you're collecting. Therefore, you do change, but it's unlikely that we will totally change our approach.
Well, if the premise could be challenged, I mean, the premise which says that kind of building represents the capability to change, to be flexible, to do all these things, which in fact, at least in a number of ways, it doesn't represent. And if in fact you're still interested in achieving those kinds of things, then you might look at a different language which allows you to do what you want to do. That's all. I mean, the Louvre is a flexible building too, at least in some degree. There's certainly shuffle exhibitions.
Yeah, but I think it's very dangerous. This is a nice game that people are playing. Yes, it is possible to call a prison flexible. People have written very good poetry in prisons. Therefore, they are good buildings. I mean, I can develop this one forever if you like. I mean, it's a sort of complete hooey. The Louvre is not a flexible building. They have been going raving mad and spending a fortune for the last 25 years trying to find a way of hanging the paintings. It represents a successful form of architecture of a certain period. I'm not saying it's a bad building, but we have to watch it, what we're saying. The whole lighting problems and so on are quite complicated. The servicing problems in the Louvre are complicated. I'm not saying that in any way that we've achieved any form of pinnacle in Beaubourg, but it reflects a different period. Anything can be flexible and changeable. You can, blast mass concrete if you want to do it, and prove that therefore it is flexible, because we have the means to to blast it. But it's not the logical way of doing it.
Were you trying to create that image of flexibility?
I think that we are interested in communicating a process. We're very interested in the word process and performance, in the sense that we feel it's one of the ways of giving a building scale grain, whatever you like to call it. And that, one is all the time looking for how, how does a building sort of relate to the aesthetic scale, whatever it is that you're interested in. One of the ways of doing it, such as here again, in the sense is the fact that you use the joints, the way that you express it, the way that you put it together, that you don't cover it up, and in a sense the fact that this space has a certain quality is, I think, because of that, rather than because it's it's perfect proportions. In fact, what this has, the way all this stuff here has, seems to me, is very much the fact that it communicates more clearly what it's about. That interests us.
What do you think about the Brancusi studio that's out in the contrast to your building?
What do I think of it? Well, that's flexibility. It was part of a political battle, which you may know about it. Basically, the museum, just again talking about change, the museum was pretty determined not to move from where they were established, the Museum of Modern Art, until way over half the building was built. When suddenly the French government decided, and again this is sort of shows political determination, that they were going to move the curator of the Museum of Modern Art, who'd been dragging his feet, and bring in Pontus Hultén from Sweden, which was a very daring thing to do, considering they were having a lot of problems already facing up to the fact that they had foreign engineers, foreign architects, and foreign contractors. They now also had a head of the museum, which was foreign. When he moved in, the rear guard at the museum, and the museum again was built and opened in 1947, the original Museum of Modern Art. So the Museum of Modern Art had a life of from 47 to 76. Yes, that's right. So that had 30 years, just to give one an idea, that museum had 30 years of life, and I dare say Beaubourg will have a lot less as a museum, especially. Anyhow, the rear guard got together under the guise that the donors and most of the key pieces of work in the building, in the museum, do not belong to the state, but belong to the donors, who are usually the family or the friends of painters now dead and sculptors now dead. And they got together and said we would not allow our collections to go to Beaubourg, which basically meant that the museum couldn't move. And the only way in which Pontus Hultén could break this sort of this situation was by trying to approach each donor separately and offering him anything he wanted, practically. And Brancusi, being about the most famous sculptor in France, and the donor, or in fact the responsible person who was a friend of his, who wasn't even a member of the family, a person who in fact used to clean his sculptures for him, to whom he left the sculptures, he was persuaded to be the first one to give in and move the Museum of Modern Art on the basis that he could have the Brancusi studio theoretically exactly as it was in the countryside, planted in the middle of the square, and that's where it is. And that's how I got there. And then once he gave in, then the others gave in. That was the system. That's very political.
I'd like to tell you about your earlier panel designs, specifically the genesis from the idea to develop.
The what?
The panel designs. How you go from your idea to development of the panels themselves.
You like
panel
yeah, I'd like to hear the first 3 words each time, sorry.
Okay, how do you go from, let's say, you take a concept, like a mathematical equation or something, for your panel, how you go from that to developing it, like through material, like designing it, figuring it out?
Well, it varies. I mean, I suppose we could divide it again, those areas of research, into 2 areas, so they overlap. One is areas where you're using absolutely standard off-the-peg components, such as panels from the refrigeration industry with high installation use, or the motor car industry, or whatever it is, the plane industry, or windows or doors, and then reusing those in a different way. In other words, using the components but giving them a different performance. Such as 1 or 2 of the small houses. And then at the other side is the using of materials like the Semfill, which is the glass fiber and cement, or even the fiberglass panels, where you're using free-form materials which don't have a standard way in which they're marketed, and from which you're starting further back in actually looking at the way the machine makes, well, inventing a machine which makes the material, which makes the product. Probably the most interesting part of the glass cement research now is working on the actual a machine which will produce the material, and that gives it the form, and that gives it its use, and vice versa.
You seem to place a lot of emphasis on change as a premise in your work, and many of the systems that have been built in this country based on concept of change have tended to, in looking at them over a period of time of their actual use, not really taken on that kind of changeability, but the people, the users, have not really converted the building to other uses. How do you see that applying to Beaubourg? Do all the program elements need that degree of change?
You see, it's a question of how, I think it's a little bit like the question was asked over there, how you judge it. I've actually never built a building that hasn't been changed. Now, whether it's, I don't think, and that includes buildings which were never meant to be changed, because I, more than Renzo, started in my first days using pretty standard materials like concrete block and so on. Well, they were being changed. I mean, of course, you can adapt buildings. That's all. That's what it comes down to it. Again, there's there's two types of change, I think. There is change due to changes during construction. Clients change their mind, usually during construction, and so do architects. It is a period where the architect and the client are reanalyzing their ideas. I mean, there's nothing. I mean, that client who comes usually to you and asks you for a sort of one extra bedroom than the one he's already got. By the time that house is finished, he's probably gone through a whole change, together with the architect, of thinking about how he lives. For 50 years he's lived like this, and then suddenly he's going to spend the maximum amount of money he's ever spent on a house, to take an example. That in itself means that he'll go through a state of change. I think that, from our point of view, we feel that a component system allows change to take, the decision to be taken rather later than would normally be considered acceptable. In other words, you can sort of put the pieces together in variable ways, probably late in that construction period. Then there's change due to the fact that the client moves out of the house, or that he gets divorced, a grandmother comes and moves in, or whatever else at a house level. There was a period where we decided we were going to start a sort of additions group in the office. In other words, people who were going to do additions to our houses, except that our group was going to do additions to our own houses before they were completed. We were always seen to be, our buildings were always being adapted before they were actually completed. So I think change does take place. All the factories that we've done, not one single factory that we've made, with the exception of the last one which was finished only a year ago, is now not only changed completely in what it's producing, and all have gone through, let's say the Reliance Controls factory, which was built in 1966, is now in its 6th owner, each one producing, light industrial components, but totally different. Totally different. And I would have thought the space itself, again, is, of course you are a more dynamic organization, but it'd be interesting to follow through how many people, what has happened to this space right here, or anywhere around here of this time, what changes have taken place.
I'm continually surprised how little change there is, particularly in our changeable system here, which is intended to be changed and modified. And even when we instigate, we've had meetings here to discuss converting the use of the facility. And when we talk about changing the configuration of this, there's a lot of resistance to changing it.
But then you're moving upstairs, I see. You're changing, for instance, I just went upstairs and I saw you've changed the library to the top.
Upstairs. We're not really...
Well, you're making changes which will define how you're going to use those spaces in a certain way. I mean, of course you can squeeze things in. I don't know, again, I mean, you've been here 5 years, that's very short, I believe, or how many years have you been here? It's a very short time for a building. I mean, we're talking about buildings with lives of a few hundred years.
I think Terry was talking about rather instantaneous change rather than change over slow periods of time. I think, and when you get into the idea that in order for things to really move with, I guess, the energy of people, they move very slowly. I guess you also have to have the machine for change that tends to make those things happen for them to happen.
I think that there is a problem where you have to train, people have to be trained to change. But I think there is another thing, and that is that change is forced by the actual change of commerce or economy. Maybe England is more critical, but as I said, I mean, the first building factory, the Gain Reliance, was built for light electronic pieces. Before we finished the building, it had been taken over to make locks for doors, and it now makes plastic floor tiles. All in the, and basically it's unrecognizable practically. I mean, they've dug holes in through all over the place. It was a rather elegant building, and depended for all its changeability on being well handled and treated. It in fact has sort of windows cut through and so on and so on. It reflects change very strongly.
Would you compare your building for me with the Con Gallery at Yale in terms of change?
Well, I haven't been to the Con Gallery at Yale, but I don't. Let's be careful. I haven't said that there is no other way of building. You must define what you are interested in, and then, in the sense of, what do you think is happening around you. There's no question that the Louvre is still being used. It doesn't mean that it does not put on severe constraints. Now, I don't know, as the Con Gallery was opened about a year ago, what constraints the Con Gallery...
I'm talking about the one designed in 63.
Oh, the Yale. No, 63, yes. No, not the 60. Not the... No, you don't know. No. Oh, but that was 53, yeah. That one. Oh, well, that's a pretty flexible space, by the way. I did my architecture in the top floor of the museum. It was being used as a school when I was there, on the top floor. And I would have thought that as far as a sort of general purpose space, is a general purpose space. The only point that I would add to it is that one of the areas that we're interested in is that I think that the facades and elevations have also got to be capable of change. In other words, up to a few years ago, we were saying the plan must be capable of change. I would now take it further and say the elevation has to be capable of change. The section has to be capable of, the elevation has to be capable of change. That's slightly learning.
Do you have what frequency you expect that kind of change to occur?
Well, it's very difficult, but all I can say is that most of the buildings I know of, most architects, have been messed up because they depend on someone understanding exactly how you're going to use it. Therefore, what you do nowadays is to put a medal on it and say, no, you are not to touch this building, whatever happens. You will use it, just as it is. The net result, sadly, is that they usually fall to pieces.